So let's take a look at a diagram of our current situation. So right now, our editor and catalog activities are both directly calling into PetDB helper in order to access the database. So for example, we can directly access the PetDB helper in order to insert a new pet which has a weight of 7 kilograms into the database. And the PetDB helper will help us insert that pet directly into the database. So this setup works well if we know the information we're inserting is correct. However, what if we have a typo and say we accidentally insert bad data into the activity? So in this example, if we insert a new pet but accidentally type in a negative weight value of 10 kilograms, well, this direct interaction method has a pitfall of inserting invalid data directly into our database. So we would end up inserting that negative 10 value directly into the database. Now this is where the content provider comes in. We can centralize the accessing and editing of the data via the content provider. So in this schema, our UI code will then directly interact with the content provider instead of directly interacting with the database. The content provider adds a layer of data validation, which we saw we needed when we incorrectly entered invalid weight values. So if there ends up being a bug, we can catch it here. So the content provider adds this added layer between the data source and the UI code is called an abstraction layer. And this is because the content provider abstracts away or hides the details of how the data is stored. So the UI code just communicates with the provider for any access to the data, and it doesn't need to care about the internals of how the provider is getting this job done. So in other words, the content provider black boxes the underlying data from the UI, because the UI doesn't care if the data is stored in a database or in individual text files. We could even store photo files, and the content provider could perfectly handle interacting with the UI code in order to display those. So in a later version of the app, if you decide to swap out the database for a different type of storage, the UI code would still remain the same and continue talking to the existing content provider. So in addition to the database, if we were to add photo files for each pet, this could work as well. Or even if the data were stored as text files instead of a database along with photo files, our content provider could handle that as well. Now you might be thinking, wow, the content provider sounds great, but how does it go about interacting with my UI? So the UI code interacts with the provider by using various methods, such as query in order to get data. There's insert, as well as update, used to update the existing rows of data. And lastly, delete, used to delete rows of data. Now, notice all these methods are similar to database methods that we used before. In all these CRUD operations, the UI code calls that method to the content provider, and that content provider itself calls its own form of the code to the data source itself. Now, let's take a moment to pause and summarize what we've covered, because it's big. So first off, the content provider helps us manage access to a structured set of data. So they can act as a good abstraction layer between the data source and the UI code, which can add data validation, help us modify how the data is stored, while the UI code remaining unaffected. Now, this brings me to the next big advantage of content providers I want to discuss. So what is it? Well, they work well with other framework classes. So to explain what that means, so take a look at this list of pets here. So currently, if pets are added or removed, and we want the latest information displayed in the UI, we must call the query and insert method each time. Well, instead of doing it that tedious method, we can leverage the power of a framework class called the cursor loader. So when pets are added or removed to this list, the list will stay updated via our cursor loader, which will automatically check when any changes have been made in the data, and then automatically refresh the list when that data does change. So the cursor loader works in conjunction with the list view and the cursor adapter, which we covered in the last course. And doing so, these display the changes that are made in the list. So implementing the cursor loader requires use of the content provider. So content providers and cursor loaders make our lives a lot easier because we don't need to manually query the data over and over again if any changes are made to it. So to recap that second big advantage, content providers work well with other framework classes. So we just saw an example of how it helps automate how data in a list is refreshed. Well, it also works with home screen widgets, something called sync adapters that sync our data to the cloud, as well as provides search suggestions in your app. So the framework team wanted to make content providers a consistent way to manage access to a structured set of data in Android. And without it, you'd have to implement a lot of that functionality on your own. So we'll be seeing more of how all this plays out in Lesson 4, after we've spent much more time in Lesson 3 setting up the content provider. Now, there's one more big advantage I want to discuss, and that's sharing data. So when you have text data or files inside your app, currently no other apps can access it. So in the case of our pet shelter app, this information is siloed, and say there's a vets app or an adoptions app or even a pet lovers app, well, they can't have access to our existing database. Well, we can expose our data to these other apps using a content provider. Doing so, other apps can access this information by interacting with the provider using the same query, insert, update, and delete methods. Well, doing so could be a security concern because maybe you don't want a particular app to access and modify all your app data. Potentially, a malicious app could delete an entire database table, so opening up your data to other apps could be dangerous if not done properly. Well, again, the framework team has this covered. The content provider manages access to data in a secure way. If you want other apps to prompt the user to grant certain permission to access the data, then the content provider can help enforce this. So other apps without proper permission won't be able to access the data. So to summarize, the 3 points that I want to call out of why content providers are pretty awesome is that they act as a good abstraction layer between our data source and our UI code, helping us with data validation. Secondly, they help us work well with other framework classes. And lastly, they help us easily share data with other apps. So for this exercise, I'd like you to go ahead and check the boxes for the accurate reasons of using a content provider. I've listed 6 here. So do they help share data more easily with other apps? Do they directly improve an app's performance? Perhaps they provide a good abstraction layer? Or maybe they only manage access to text data. Maybe they also work well with other Android framework classes. Or maybe content providers are only written in XML, and that might be good for us.